Hi, and welcome back to our APES flipped classroom. Today we are talking about the topic of ecological succession. So let's just jump right in and talk about what succession is and some of the important characteristics of it. So when we talk about ecological succession, there's really two primary types of ecological succession, and both of them are a series of predictable stages of growth that an ecosystem goes through, and we usually are specifically referring to a forest. So those two types are primary succession. So when we're talking about primary succession, we're talking about starting from bare rock. This is an area with no previous soil formation. And in primary succession, we begin with what we call pioneer species, and those would be lichens or mosses, and those spores are carried by the wind. They grow directly on rock, so they don't need soil, and they actually break it down to form soil. So we're going to begin with the bare rock, and we'll talk about the different ways that we start with primary succession. The lichens will colonize the rocks, followed shortly by mosses, and then small annual plants and lichens. And we move through a series of stages from those pioneer species to the intermediate or middle succession species to our climax community. The other kind of succession is secondary succession. And when we talk about secondary succession, it starts from already established soil in an area where we had a disturbance, some sort of a natural or human-caused disturbance that cleared out the majority of plant life. And so in secondary succession, we have different pioneer species. So rather than having to begin with mosses and lichens, because we already have soil, we can begin with grasses, wildflowers, and small shrubs. So we begin with our disturbance, whether that's a fire, a tornado, a hurricane, some form of a landslide or flooding. And then we go through our pioneer species of annual plants, grasses, and perennials, and into those intermediate species and the climax community. So let's talk about these stages. So the stages are really characterized by which kinds of plant species are dominating the ecosystem. And that's because different species are adapted to the conditions of those different stages. So early on, our pioneer or early succession species are going to appear because the ground is simply bare rock, or in the case of secondary succession, bare soil. These are plants whose seeds or spores are easily spread by wind or by animals. They tend to be very fast growing. They're tolerant of shallow or non-existent soil and tolerant of lots of sunlight because there's no shade for mature plants. So our examples in primary succession are going to be mosses and lichens because those can grow on bare rock. In secondary succession, we're thinking about things like wildflowers, berries, raspberries, grasses, or sedges. Our mid-successional species or our intermediate species are going to appear after the pioneer species have helped to develop the deeper soil through their cycles of growth and death. So it's important to recognize that part of what we're talking about with succession is not just the growth of the plants. So it's not enough to simply have mosses and lichens grow. They do a great job of breaking down the rock, but they have to die and they have to decompose in order to begin the creation of soil. So our mid-successional species are fast-growing, larger plants that need deeper soils. They need more nutrients than the pioneer species, but they're still very sun tolerant. So we again see these stages. We're starting with the pioneer plants and moving into the shrubs. Those are our mid-successional species, as are some of the pioneer trees. So the young forest. Okay, and then our final stage is our late successional climax community species. Those are going to appear last. They require deep soil. They require nutrient-rich soil. And so you have to have had a lot of cycles of growth and death by those early and mid-successional species in order to have these climax community species. These tend to be large, slow-growing trees that are tolerant of shade. Pines tend to be earlier, and hardwoods tend to be later. So they're more shade tolerant, but they require deep soils for their large root networks. So things like maples, oaks, even beeches. Okay, so let's go into the details of primary succession. It occurs in an area that has not been colonized by plants in the past. It does not have soil. We are talking about bare rock. This can be rock that's exposed after a glacial retreat. This can be volcanic rock. In some extreme cases, it can even be caused by avalanches or mudslides. So the very first things, the pioneer species, are those mosses and lichens. There are spore-generated plants. They don't have seeds, they have spores. They're able to grow directly on the rock because they actually secrete acids through their root systems that break down the rock and release the minerals that contain the nutrients that they need. So the mosses and lichens actually cause chemical weathering of the rock. So they're actually breaking down the rock by chemicals that they release through their root systems. Then as those mosses and lichens die off, they decompose and their organic matter starts to mix with the broken down rock, and we start to form an initial shallow soil. Not a lot of soil, but a little bit from that dead, decaying organic matter. So we've gone from bare rock to lichens and mosses, and our next stage of the of primary succession is going to be those small annual plants and moving into the perennial herbs and grasses. And all of those are considered pioneer stages. Secondary succession occurs in an area that already has established soil, but has had most of its producers removed by some sort of a disturbance. There's still wind dispersed seeds of plants that are fast growing and sun tolerant, but they tend to be grasses or wildflowers or weeds, not mosses and lichens, because we're not talking about bare rock, we are talking about soil. Sometimes, especially if our disaster was fire, the soil is actually even enriched by the ash from the fire. Occasionally with landslides, we'll see over-enriched soils as well. Overall, this is a much more rapid process than primary succession because you don't have to break down and weather the rocks. So we have a much faster process. We still have pioneer species of annual plants and grasses and perennials rather than starting at mosses and lichens. Okay, so here's your practice FRQ. Based on this graph, explain whether spruce trees are an early, middle, or late successional species. Remember, to explain means several sentences. I want you to justify your answer. As always, look forward to seeing you in class. If you have any questions, let me know.